Well, how's everybody doing today? This is Dr. Winkler again. We are still working on Modern Civilization course, History 151G. I believe this is the 5th lecture, and have been discussing issues relating to the Reformation. However, at this point, we're on to the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic reaction. Remember what we were discussing last time? Last time we were talking about Erasmus and how Erasmus reacted to the kinds of things that are going on. Why would we pay attention to Erasmus? Because everybody does. This is an extremely important intellectual who a lot of people greatly respect. In any event, I went into some detail telling you about his diatribe on free will and some of his arguments. Remember, the last point I made is not necessarily that either Luther's right or Erasmus is right, but it does depend on your perspective and which scriptures you tend to refer to in order to understand other scriptures. If you come from the Protestant area, you will use certain scriptures that do have a tendency to support your basic ideas and help you understand the other scriptures. If you come from the Catholic tradition, you will tend to use other scriptures that tend to support your position, and you use those ideas to interpret other scriptures. Now, we're still talking about the Counter-Reformation. Remember, I mentioned that two major factors of that are piety and mysticism. Let's look at how some people get involved in this. I'm going to mention two people, Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint Ignatius Loyola. These are people that are very important in the Counter-Reformation. Let me talk a little bit broadly about the Reformation itself. The Reformation does have an large impact in Germany, Holland, Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, as I've already was discussing at some length, England. There is a Protestant movement. Maybe 10% of the population in France actually became Protestant. However, we don't really hear about Protestant movements in Spain. One of the reasons for this is even before there is a Protestant Reformation or a Counter-Reformation, the church in Spain had already taken abuses in hand. There was a Cardinal, Carlos Jimenez, who had already gone in and tried to get the church to clean up its act. And indulgences were not sold in Spain. Looking at Spain, therefore, as a very strong Catholic area, it would not surprise us that if some of the important people from the Catholic Reformation were in fact Spaniards, and this happens to be the case, not always, but at least in these very important people, relating to these very important people. Let's take a look at Saint Teresa of Avila. One of the reasons why I have her full name down here is there are other Saint Teresas, so we want to make sure which one we are discussing. She's a Spanish girl. She's very strong in the faith. At the age of about 11, she decided that it's time to die for the faith. What's the best way to die? Become a martyr. Her idea was to go across from Spain into what you and I would call Morocco, where Muslims live. And of course, she would present herself there, and I don't know what she was supposed to do, maybe try to preach the gospel. And in that respect, the Muslims would kill her. So now she becomes a martyr for the faith. And this is someone with very strong beliefs, no doubt about it at all. Well, before she got down there and got herself killed, a kindly uncle essentially took her aside and said, oh, by the way, you don't have to die to serve the Lord. You can live to serve the Lord. So she becomes a nun. And there are many thousands of nuns. There's some things that are very different about her. She talks about being a mystic. she has a very strong personal union with the Spirit of the Lord. Why does she have this? Well, probably simply because of her piety, being such a wonderful person. She actually says that when the Spirit of the Lord would come upon her, she would be in such a wonderful state of ecstasy. Let's get St. Teresa up here. I mentioned Bernini earlier when I was talking about the greatest sculptors that have ever lived. Remember, I said in the Renaissance, some art historians say the greatest sculptors were Michelangelo and Bernini. Bernini did a sculpture of St. Teresa of Avila when the Spirit of the Lord had come upon her. I guess this angel, since this angel has a arrow, it's a little bit like a Cupid, essentially, I guess, sending the Spirit of the Lord into her heart. Obviously, this is highly symbolic. Well, let's see if we can take a look at her a little bit. She looks like she's passing out at a rock concert. I can still remember when the Beatles came to the United States in 1964, and on television they showed the crowds of young women who are in, shall we say, a very high state of excitement or ecstasy. And I'm glad they were having a good time, by the way. If you want to get a good idea of what these look like, the Beatles made a motion picture called It's a Hard Day's Night, where they depict young women freaking out over them. Nonetheless, I'm not really here to judge the nature of the quality of the sculpture. And you can see that St. Teresa is very, shall we say, a little overdressed for the occasion. But her ecstasy, she's in joy. You see, nuns, priests, monks, they live in a state of, shall we say, well, you and I would call it physical discomfort. They do it without a lot of creature comforts. Sometimes they don't wear clothing that's terribly comfortable. Sometimes they wear rough clothing, rough woolen, that kind of thing, rather than elegant woven silks. Only the very wealthy people, of course, had silk. They tend to lead a pretty austere life. They don't go to many concerts. They tend to pray a lot. They're on their knees a lot. Their knees get sore. They fast at various times to gain their spirituality. And some people say, why on earth would you do this? What a drag. Isn't this... Now, come on, live a little. But see, St. Teresa takes this to a different level. She says, the service of the Lord is not something that's discomforting. It is something that's comforting. It's not something in which you find yourself deprived. You found yourself fulfilled in this ecstasy of the love of the Spirit of the Lord. We do have accounts about some of the women who were with her, some of the other nuns, and I think this might be an exaggeration. Nonetheless, there were some of these other nuns that would look at her when she was apparently in one of these states of ecstasy. And when they did, it was like she floated off the floor, kind of into the air. That's a pretty good state. Well, see, this message, which St. Teresa is giving, is something that's very important, because a lot of people say, oh, I can serve the Lord, I can be happy, and in following the precepts of the religion, I will be able to gain a higher state. How do we know she was a saint? Well, in Catholicism, every good work gets a merit. A saint is somebody who is dead, who has enough merit to go up to be worthy of the grace of God and go to heaven. But there's merit left over. They don't need it. When there's a bona fide miracle associated with that person's clothing, body, then you can say that that person's a saint because there's enough merit left over that other people can use it. There are bona fide miracles that are associated with her. There was a story that when they, after she was died and buried and disinterred her body, obviously a saint's body, clothing, can be very, very valuable. They are relics. So they want to make use of her body. In any event, they dig her up, and rather than smelling a decomposed body, I'm sure that would be very unpleasant. It's like they smelled the fragrance of roses. She starts a religious order. Remember, I said there were new orders. She starts a religious order, which we call the Barefoot Carmelites, where many nuns take these ideas to various places and bring the joy of the Lord to many areas. Let's take a look at St. Ignatius Loyola. St. Ignatius Loyola is also a Spaniard, and he has a very interesting biography. You see, he is a man above men. What does he want in life? Oh, goodness. He wants to break hearts, women's hearts, of course. He wants to be good-looking. He wants to be, shall we say, masculine. And he wants to accomplish great things on the battlefield to show his prowess. I'm not sure we really have a modern counterpart, but if we did, be something like some professional athletes. Boy, they look good, they act good, they perform brilliantly in their chosen sport. Now, St. Ignatius Loyola was a soldier. He was a knight. Unfortunately for the history of Spain and for the history of France, there's been a very lengthy period of time where these countries do not get along. We'll make a big deal about that when we talk about Napoleon. That's way down the line. Well, these countries don't get along. There are border disputes. And there's this large mountain range between Spain and France. And so because the mountain range is so formidable, we don't really see a lot of movement of borders going back and forth. But unfortunately, there's a lot of combat. There's a battle there at this time frame called the Battle of Pamplona. See if I can get Pamplona on the map for you here. Okay. Images, probably not what I'm looking at. Yeah, I wanted to, if I get a map, I'll probably get a map of Orem, Utah or something. Yep. No, here's Pamplona, Spain. And you can see it's fairly close to the borders of France. Anyway, there's a siege, battle going on. St. Ignatius Loyola is manly, and he's up there and he's on the parapet. He's inspiring his men, and he gets hit. He's hit with a cannonball. Large cannonball, probably blown him in half. Probably a smaller ball. It hits him in the thigh. It whacks his leg and breaks the bone. Well, what can you do? Well, of course, you're going to have to go to a physician. Now, the good physicians are, oh, incidentally, before I get off the topic entirely, yes, the Spanish did resist the attack of the French, so we got a French victory. Excuse me, a Spanish victory. Let's go back to St. Ignatius Loyola. He's had this terrible wound. This is awful. Smashes the bone. Well, you've got to go to a physician. Try to fix it. Medicine at this time frame left a lot to be desired. Can we say the best physicians are probably down in Madrid, making good money, helping rich people. You're probably not going to find the best physicians up in a military camp, very close to the border. Well, let's see. Yeah. Okay, I'll come back to that one minute. So we got St. Ignatius Loyola. And how about getting a picture of him up here? And we would normally think that a man of great piety would look very good. And in this case, he certainly does. Well, in any event, he's badly injured. The bone has been broken. Well, somebody's going to have to set the bone. The physician set the bone improperly. See, rather than having the bones come together like this, one is slightly askew. This is devastating because you've got to show a good leg if you're a man at this time frame. I would like to show you more contemporaneous pictures, but this will kind of give you the idea. Very tight-fitting hose. In fact, some people are somewhat scandalized by this. They say that there's not enough cloth here to hide men's shame, either from the front or from the back. And I would perhaps go in that direction as well. But you see, this is what you want to have. You got to have a manly, very nice shaped leg. But if the bone came together and it's like this, you're going to have a bulge in your thigh. And this looks very bad. The bone has started to heal. Well, what can you do about something that's misshapen? He submits to other operations. It sounds horrible to me. The only real painkiller they had that time frame was liquor. And I imagine he was liquored up pretty good. That might have taken away some of his pain, but certainly not all of it. So the physicians went in and cut through the flesh again and sawed down the part that's protruding up here. After a while, I don't know how many operations, I think it was more than one, any event, then it's down to about the same. But because of this operations, now his one leg is permanently, I believe it's like 2 inches shorter than the other one. Okay, maybe your hose looks pretty good in this case, but being crippled also doesn't make you seem to be so manly. The idea of him going back and being a knight, probably because he doesn't look right, was not really an option. In any event, there he is far away. He's out in a military post. And he's going through these operations. He's trying to do anything he can to distract himself from having to deal with that pain all the time. So he wants to read. He thinks if you can concentrate enough, you're going to take away some of the pain. A few years ago, I had some severe toothaches. And you got to wait, you know how it is, it always happens on a Friday, so you can't see a dentist on Monday. And I decided, well, I will distract myself by reading books. He's better than I am. It didn't work. I read. Concentration was very limited, and it hurt a great deal. Nonetheless, he's trying to distract himself. And he calls for books. What he wants to read is knightly romance. He wants to read about courage and victory, men fighting, the kinds of things he wants to relate to in his life. They said, we don't have anything like that here. And he says, well, what do you have? Well, we got these books of devotion. I'll read anything. So he brings the books of devotion. He starts reading these things. The books of devotion would include how you should live your life, you should turn yourself to Jesus. We should admire these saints and follow their example. He has a change of heart. One time when he's in excessive pain, he says he has a dream, call it a vision if you like, where St. Peter came and told him to serve the Lord. So this man, this knight, now wants to serve the Lord. He has a complete change in heart. Quite frankly, being crippled and having gone through that much pain, and we all come to the realization we're going to die. Why on earth would you not serve the Lord to have a better situation? He believes that and he starts in order, but he believes that one of the big problems of the Protestant Reformation was a lack of education. You see, going all the way back to the pious parish priests, which we talked about earlier, when I mentioned there's the accusation of ignorant priests. What if you had churchmen on the spot when the Protestant Reformation broke out, who knew their doctrine well enough to publicly debate and refute these people. So one thing you need is education. Jesuits, even the order today, are highly involved in education. They end up being university professors. I remember meeting a Jesuit priest at one time. He had 2 doctor's degrees. Now, working at university, I do have a pretty good sense. A lot of people have a doctor's degree, which is time-consuming and it's hard to get. Nonetheless, 2 of them, you want to go through all that twice. This kind of education was not uncommon among these people. Anyway, St. Ignatius Loyola decides that he's going to get the best education possible. And the most prestigious school, particularly in Catholic Europe, is the University of Paris, because the University of Paris has the most prestigious school dealing with church theology. So he goes to the University of Paris to make advanced studies in church theology. In one of these little quirks of history, this is kind of interesting. He's there at exactly the same time as is John Calvin. There's another important man there at the same time, which I couldn't go into enough detail to mention. But anyway, his name was Michael Servetus. And Michael Servetus was a very important Anabaptist. We have 3 extremely important intellectuals that are there at the University of Paris at exactly the same time. Did they know each other? See, you and I think of a modern university, and we think of a modern university as being huge. I mean, my goodness, you could walk around campus and, several tens of thousands of people here, over 30,000. You could walk around, and even in crowded hallways, and not see the same person twice, let alone get to know anybody. You might get to know some people in your classrooms. The University of Paris is very typical in many respects the other universities that are around at the time in the size of their student body. We're only talking a few hundred students. Could you imagine if you were here for months, years, with 200 students taking not huge different kinds of classes, similar kind of classes? You'd probably get to know everybody by sight or talking. It would be fascinating if we knew they knew each other. I think it's very likely at least they knew something about each other. Did they have a conversation? If so, what was it like? Is it hard enough for you? I mean, you would think these people that are so very, very strong in their faith could have extremely interesting conversations. I would pay money to sit in and listen to a conversation between St. Ignatius Loyola and John Calvin. Wow. Of course, I'd have to learn some languages, whatever language. They might have been conversing in Latin. But I'd have to become quite astute at that language to really know what was going on. Fascinating, fascinating possibility, but we don't have enough records to see if they did meet, and if so, what was the nature of their relationship. This reminds me a little bit of an experience I had in one of the halls on campus. Have you ever noticed this? Have you ever been walking someplace and you kind of walk through a conversation? You're walking down the hall and you actually have, you're walking down the hall and you hear a few words. One of the best conversations I ever walked through is this, walking down the hall, and there's a couple of young gentlemen talking. This is all I heard of the conversation, because I kept going. One young man says to the other young man, well, marry money if you can. And the other guy comes back and says, yes, but make sure it's her money, not her parents. True wisdom. Gentlemen, you might want to take this to heart. Nonetheless, we don't know if they knew each other. When we have his followers, he makes sure, St. Ignatius Loyola makes sure these men are well educated. He doesn't want to have the possibility of heresy involved here at all. He actually puts the society, calls himself Jesuits, which we also remember as the Society of Jesus. He puts his movement directly under the authority of the Pope. So they will never do anything without the Pope's acquiescence. The Jesuits become extremely important in fighting against Protestantism. Yes, the Protestant Reformation's already been going for a few decades. But at that point, whenever there's a debate, when anybody says, look, we're thinking about going Protestant, let's have a discussion. It's the Jesuits who stand up and debate, sometimes face to face. They debate the Protestants. They debate them in press. They send out missions. They are in one of the groups in the forefront of the Counter-Reformation. When we take a look at the effectiveness of the Jesuits, we do have a tendency to look at Poland as one of their successes. There was a significant Protestant movement in Poland. Would the state actually become Protestant? Well, probably if you get the leaders to go Protestant, then they will essentially drag the rest of the nation along with them. There was apparently, starting in the 1540s, a real possibility this might happen. The Jesuits, however, show up, and they start to write their pamphlets. They start to make the debates. And it is widely believed this was a major factor in making sure that Poland would not go Protestant. As I'm sure you all know, even to this day, Poland is predominantly, almost entirely Catholic. And we can perhaps say that's at least partially because of the Jesuits. Okay, so we got the Barefoot Carmelites, we got the Jesuits, who are making extremely important contributions. However, there's another issue here, and I'm going to refer you now down to the Council of Trent. One of the problems, as far as the Catholics saw, when the Protestants are bringing out these new ideas, or shall we say, emphasizing these ideas, what is the clarity of church doctrine? Now there's been saints going way back early, St. Augustine being perhaps the most important of them all. There's been a number of writers over centuries talking about church doctrine, talking about church theology, and of course we have popes and others that are also giving statements on church teachings and practice. But do we have all of these ideas perfectly solidified? The idea is that it does not, has not happened. And therefore we have the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is one of your most important conclaves in the entire history of Catholicism. There is no list, completely accepted list of the ecumenical councils that are accepted as doctrine. But there were about, since in the last 2,000 years, there's probably been close to 22 of them. This is among the most important of them all. They met in Trent. Trent is in Trentino. It's actually technically in northern Italy. Which is, okay, here we go again. In northern Italy, as you can see, Trentino is right here. Did I mispronounce that? Any event, it is in northern Italy. Well, look at the time when it meets. These are the major conclaves. From 1545, 47, 1551 to 52, 1562 to 63. It literally runs almost 20 years. You say, why are the big gaps? Well, you have responsibilities. The Protestants are pushing back in a lot of places. You don't want to bring the most important people in Christendom together away from their responsibilities for lengthy periods of time. It's expensive, it's time consuming. These people have a long ways to come. So you meet in various conclaves. Now, notice the date of the first time they met. This is 1545. In Martin Luther dies in 1546. He's still alive. Of course, this is decades after he first made his appeal. I demand to be heard in a council of the church. There was no council for him to meet in. Now there is one. They invite him to come. Well, he's elderly by this time frame. His health is not terribly good. He suffers from kidney stones, among other things. And finally, rather than coming, he decides he's not going to. And he writes one of his numerous tracts attacking the papacy. And it's, behold the papacy founded by the devil. Obviously, he's not going to come. He's going to continue his attacks, at least until the day he dies. In all deference to him, he might have died on the journey. He's simply aged and infirm. Physically infirm, I should say. However, probably nothing would have been accomplished at that point anyway. There have been so much accusations. There have been so many things that have been said and done so far that by the time you get to this point, probably nothing would have been accomplished. But it is kind of curious that he was invited and he didn't come. Well, the debates go on. They go on almost interminably. You meet for lengthy periods of time. Various people are talking about various things. Some groups want to push in one direction. Some people don't like that. So we have to end up with major consensuses. And these are some of them, some that are worth remembering, that help us understand how the church had attempted to fix its problems. Okay, one of the issues was the Bible. There are vernacular, remember, in the language of the people, Bibles in various places. The Catholic Church has authority in numerous countries and numerous languages. They can't sit down and say, well, our official language is Italian or Spanish or French. What they say is this: the Vulgate will be our official. The Vulgate, the old Latin version, is our official Bible. However, it does not exclude the idea of upgrading the text. That the text might have, we might over time figure out that the text needs to be improved in these areas. I'm going to say to a slight extent, this might be kind of a tipping your hat, if you will, to Erasmus, who came up with Novum Testamentum, which was a more authoritative, shall we say, version of the New Testament. They're going to use the Vulgate. It can be upgraded. However, other translations are allowed. But you're going to use the Vulgate for your official doctrinal interpretations. We've mentioned this. I'm going to mention it again in this context. Remember, we said in both camps, you can read the Bible as a Catholic, you can read the Bible as a Lutheran or Protestant, but in both cases, you cannot interpret it yourself. The church, in this case, does keep the right to interpret Scripture in its own hands. Okay. Now, Scripture and tradition. I've already mentioned this. I am repeating myself. The church actually believes in two areas in which you decide information and where you upgrade, shall we say, the church. One of which is Scripture. The Protestants would clearly agree with that. Scripture and tradition. Remember, we know about practices early in the Christian faith. This is way back in Roman times. Like confessing your sins. They would actually stand up early on in Christian churches. In the first few centuries, stand up and in front of the entire congregation, I'm a sinner. You wouldn't believe what I did with my taxes last year. Oh my golly. I don't control my dogs. They're all over the neighborhood. See, I'm a sinner. That's not in Scripture, is it? No, it's not. But it was practiced early on. So can we not look at traditions as well? As you well know, in Catholicism, we have what we call auricular confession. Since the Lateran Council of 1215, now you confess only to the priest. You see, you can upgrade your religion over time because of tradition and because of the Spirit of the Lord is in the council. So there's a slightly different thing. Now, there's something else which Catholics eventually found embarrassing, and that is the index of prohibited books. You and I are very familiar with indexes. Can you go back to the council here? You and I are very familiar with indexes. When you try to find something in a book, you can page through it, you look at the table of contents. Why don't you just go back to the index? Go back to the back of the book. Go back there and find the pages what you are looking for. It can help a great deal when you're doing research. It can also help a great deal when you're doing a term paper. Find it. In this case, the index is not an index where you're finding something. The index is a list of prohibited books. The list of prohibited books are the things that are out there that have been published that good Catholics do not read. You are forbidden to read these books. The index grew over time. I could imagine the first lists included Martin Luther, John Calvin, many other reformers as well. Probably were on there. Over time, we do see some intellectuals when you get into the Enlightenment. You see some Enlightenment thinkers who are heavily questioning the validity of the Christian faith. They don't want you to read those either. It was abolished in the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. By that time frame, it had grown to a list of about 4,000 books. That's an awful lot of material. When the church did away with the index, it's like admitting that we're not afraid of this knowledge anymore. But clearly, this does indicate, at least at this time frame, there's certain knowledge that they are afraid that they don't want their people to read. Well, remember, it was indulgences that brought up Martin Luther, and it was a scandal that bothered many other reformers. And the quaestor, this is the office of the indulgence hawker. Remember, this is the guy on the street corner out in the city square saying, I got a piece of paper, give me some money, we'll send that down to Rome, and we have put your name on it, and by darned, you are freed from some of the punishments of sin. Remember, these were the abuses where the quaestor was overstating church doctrine. Doing away with that office would, shall we say, rein in that kind of exaggeration and that kind of scandal. It clearly would. However, I want to make something clear here. The idea of giving money to the church, and by extension, we can say giving alms to the poor, there's a lot of ways you can use money. This is still considered to be acceptable. You can still give money to the church. So the idea, and that's a righteous act, and obviously when you do something bad, you do something good to compensate for that. So some of the ideas that were being bandied about the importance of indulgences are still part of church doctrine. But the abuses now are going to be set aside. Education, well, education, if you educate people, probably should have mentioned this when we were talking about the Jesuits. But it is relevant in both discussions. The Jesuits and other Catholics are going to be very, very good at expressing, teaching people. Can we say that if you were taught something, particularly as a young child, you accept it less critically? It's almost like part of your culture. I'm an American, I speak English. I guess if I spent years in other countries, I could learn to speak another language. But English seems natural and normal to me. I am familiar to a certain extent with American culture. I'm very comfortable with it. If I were to leave and go someplace else, I might find a different culture a problem as far as relating to it. And I could live there a long time and never relate to it fully. I might carry my background of being an American with me the remainder of my life. Same thing is true with religion. When people are taught religion as children, there is a tendency for them to accept it as normal and natural. that is a point at which you can relate to the world. And when they become adults, it becomes less likely that they would go against that and change to a very different tradition. People without this kind of educational background, who might nominally be Catholic, I was baptized and Mom took me to Mass twice, when they become adults and hear another message, it is easier for them to change. So the church, probably taking a nod from the Jesuits, view education as something very important. Now, Reformed clergy. Remember the scandals. The priest doesn't know Latin well enough. He's not terribly versed with doctrine. And he looks at the wrong ladies at the wrong time. Let's make sure the clergy is above reproach. They know their doctrine. They know their Latin. They are kept in a certain way. They are watched, shall I say, to make sure that they do not look around in the wrong direction. So now you have the clergy, which I can't say it's ever above reproach. There's always something that somebody's doing that somebody doesn't like. But can we say it's much improved? This is very important. Well, can we keep on calling the council back? It's expensive, it's time consuming. There are real reasons why it slows down church functions when you have these councils. So when the council dissolves, when it leaves, they simply say that the interpretation of what was passed at the council is left up to the Pope. His position as leader of the church will in fact be the position that will make sure that all this is implemented and best understood. Can we say by that papal infallibility is implied? The Pope cannot err, he cannot make a mistake. So this is implied. However, it's really not until the First Vatican Council, is that 1869, 1870, the First Vatican Council, where the council did say papal infallibility. Popes cannot make a mistake. Well, okay, the Catholic Church cleaned up its act. It's much more progressive. It's going well into the future now. The Protestant camps have also been well defined. And this actually brings us into the modern world. Well, before I get off religion entirely, and religion's not the only aspect of this class, I need to talk a little bit to you about witches, about the witch craze, because there's clearly a very strong religious impact on what's happening here. Before we get into that, we really do need to have a definition of what a witch is. I know in reading stories and seeing motion pictures about things that go bump in the night, sometimes we say that anytime anything's wrong or creepy, it's a witch. Well, let's look at it and see if we can have a good definition. If we were in class, it's a question I like to ask my students. What is a witch? Of course, people are thinking about that. And you people are so good. I come up with a lot of very, very good definitions or very good aspects. However, I want to say this. A witch is not something that makes you clean your room. That might be a shrewish woman or somebody who's not treating you the way you want to be. That's not a witch. What a witch is this. It's a pact with the devil. A witch is a person who is a human agent. Let's get my marker up here. It is a human agent to do evil. I mentioned this in a different context. Remember in 1505, Martin Luther is caught in a thunderstorm. Whoa, my goodness. Well, he might die. You know, lightning does kill people. He had real reason to be afraid. But remember his rationale, which is very common for his age, is that in effect this happened because of the evil forces that are around. People believe that there are the devil and his minions, which we call demons, are out there doing bad things. They make bad things happen. This is a belief that's been around for a long time. It still exists today. What a witch is is some human being that is involved in aiding the devil and his demons, his minions, to do bad things. That is a devil. Excuse me, that's a witch. Can we take a look at this? You see, it's very, very hard to push back the devil and the demons. Well, you can by living righteously and having proper, if you're Catholic, have proper authority. These kind of things, you can push them back, use the cross, those kinds of things. But you can't destroy them. But a human being who's cooperating with the devil to make bad things happen, it can be thunderstorms, it can be a lot of things. And you can either inhibit or destroy that person. Then you're actually thwarting the power of the devil, because the power of the devil is working through them. Therefore, you can attack people whom you believe to be a witch, someone who's cooperating with the devil. There are misunderstandings about the witch craze. Some people tend to think, oh, by the way, I want to say this. Sometimes people want to divide witches by gender. A witch is a woman, and what's a whorelock or something is a man. For the purpose of our discussion, I'm not dividing this on gender. I'm saying a witch can be a woman, a witch can be a man. I will come back and talk about the gender issue involved in the witch craze later on. Right now, we're just talking about them, both male and female. Okay, witch craze. Define the witch craze. Can we say the witch hunts? You're going out after people. You have trials. We'll talk about this later. You come out and you have trials, and sometimes you're after people, and you try to find them out in your community. You're trying to find them out in the forest. The craze. You're really nervous, and you're looking for these people all over. That's the witch craze. Of course, this can be very devastating when you start tormenting and killing people accused of being witches. Some people say, well, the Middle Ages are superstitious. Well, they are. Can we say the ancient world superstitious? Yes. Is the modern world superstitious? Well, I'd like to think a lot less as you and I speak. On the other hand, in the modern world from 1500 to present, we have a lot of superstitions. Some people want to look at this and say, oh, this is something that happened in the Middle Ages. The witch craze is the Middle Ages. There was a belief in witches in the Middle Ages. But a witch craze, we really don't see that at this time frame. The witch in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, we often call this the Dark Age, which we probably shouldn't. It's not as dark as it's been portrayed. The state actually said that if anybody accuses somebody for a witch and persecutes them as a witch, we're going to come down on you because that's against the law. The Catholic Church, the church of this time frame, is saying that anybody who believes in witches, anybody who persecutes people, church law will come down on you, and you are going to suffer in the eternities. We'll cut you off. Now, because in the early Middle Ages, I'm talking Charlemagne in this case, and the state and the church were both condemning people who believe in witches or persecuted people. Obviously, there had to be a belief and some action going on in order for them to come down on it. On the other hand, we do not read about large numbers of witches. One of the accusations against Joan of Arc, and she was burned, as you know, on the stake, 1431, was that her visions were from evil sources. Does that make her a witch? Maybe it does. One of the accusations that they ended up using to condemn her. Germany was one of the hotbeds, shall we say, of the witch craze when it really got going. But before 1500, we only read about several, literally in the last quarter century, like from 1475 to 1500. We only read about a couple of, just a handful, very small number, one or two, witches that were actually condemned in Germany. So we're not seeing large numbers. The witch craze is actually a modern phenomenon. It starts shortly after 1500, and it's worse by half century. Let's say you're looking at this, if I had a graph, I do not, that here's the year 1500, well, it gets bad to 1550. From 1550, it goes up to 1600, it gets worse. From 1600 to 1650, it's worse yet. It's getting worse as we progress deeper into the modern time frame. Therefore, can we say that the witch craze is modern and not medieval? Sure we can. How bad was it? I have a little bit of a hard time with some of these numbers. One study I said read that they're probably averaging, this is not just a few areas, this is very large areas, like almost all of Europe, that you're burning about 1,000 witches per year for about 150 years. The math is like 150,000. My problem with this is when you try to understand the numbers, when you try to go in and say what's happening in this city, what's happening in this province, and you have 10 killed, 20 killed, 30 killed, these kinds of things, here, 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 and here. And sometimes you have a witch craze, a witch hysteria, if you will, in a city or region, and you have it here and you kill a number of people, and then you don't have anything there for another 20 years. I want to think that this is an exaggeration. I want to think that the historians are rounding this up. Whatever the number is, can we say it is not just the number of people you are killing and tormenting, it is also the number of people you are intimidating. You see, you can have society living in fear, though you're only killing certain numbers of people at certain periods of time. You have everybody living in fear of this. So the idea is much broader than just the number of people you're killing. What are the factors in the witch craze? What do we tend to see that brings this out? We have two major factors: belief and torture. A number of years ago, and historians are always looking for another way of analyzing things, historians have taken a look and said, oh, what were they eating? What do people eat? They eat bread. Bread is a staff of life. Probably the major part of your diet is bread. And historians were saying, well, let's look at them. They kept the breads in boxes. Been doing that for a long time. Certain kinds of grains you put in there, like rye, over time they might start to deteriorate a little bit. Yeah, you can leave bread in a box long enough, it'll deteriorate somewhat. And they're arguing that, well, maybe there was kind of psychedelic properties to some of these kinds of things. So the logic of their argument is this: there was these kind of weird things around, and people ate that and started persecuting witches. I'm going, my goodness, how long have been people eating bread? How long has bread been sitting in boxes? How long has bread been made of the same kind of materials? When unfortunately, some young people were experimenting with drugs, like back in the 1960s, and popping LSD, which is a psychedelic drug, they were not running around saying, oh, there's a witch out there, let's kill her. I don't think that's our explanation. Quite frankly, I just don't give any merit to this at all. But belief in torture. Let's look at this directly. If you believe in something, you do have a tendency to see it. If you do not believe in something, you have a tendency not to see it. I was bragging about being American a little while ago. Well, I'm an American, love my country. When I look around, I want to say that my country is great. So I look around and say, I see evidence, don't I? Interstate freeway system. I can remember when you had to go from town to town. Now we got the interstate. Whoa, great country. Great opportunities. You can get into various universities much more easily than you used to could. Costs too much, but we can say that we're educating our society. Unemployment tends to be down. So I can look at things and see them as being fitting with my beliefs. But if I don't believe that, if I come from another country, Mexico, for example, they come across and say, you people, you don't do these things right. Belief does very strongly have a tendency to have us see what we want to see. To have a witch craze, you've got to believe in witches. I have right here belief or traditions of witches. Where would you get this from? Well, let's take a look at some of the scriptural justifications. The King James Version is the one most commonly used until fairly recently in most English-speaking congregations. Other translations have been made popular more recently, but still the King James Version is what people are reading, shall we say, in the early 1600s in England and later in America. In Exodus 22 and 18, it has a scripture. This is the King James Version translation. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Okay, says there's witches. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Says they're witches. Kill them. Look at the time frame when the translation is made. When you look at the time frame of the translation, the belief of witches is very strong in Protestant areas, including England. And if you can read something and interpret it in such a manner to already fit your belief system, you'll do that. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Can we say that's misleading? A better translation would be, do not allow a sorceress to live. Is a sorceress a witch? Well, a sorceress is not really in league with the devil. She might be involved in dark arts, doing things that people disapprove of. But is she actually cooperating with the devil to cause thunderstorms, to cause people to get sick, to cause the cow to die? It doesn't really say that. A sorceress is usually involved in dark arts. And shall we say talking to the dead? We can say that that is what the biblical writers didn't like. But it's not the same thing. It's bad, but it's not the same thing. Some people say the sorceress is a medium. A medium is somebody who can communicate supposedly with the dead. Okay. If you want to believe that this gives you justification for persecuting witches, well, you can. But if you want not to believe that, and you read this, shall we say, a little bit better translation, you're talking about a different person. One of the more stunning, odd, shall we say, entire scripture, which we find in the Bible, is found in 1 Samuel 28. There's a king of Israel called Saul. Saul is of the tribe of Benjamin. He is the king, and he has a problem. His problem's named David. Saul ran afoul of the prophet because he did not follow what the prophet told him to do, and that's kill people and eradicate all of their animals. And Saul came back and brought the animals back. So he spared the animals, so the prophet's upset with him. When David comes by, the great hero, the boy who, according to the Bible, killed Goliath, in the book of Chronicles, it actually says another man killed Goliath. Whatever, he's a hero. And a civil war breaks out between Saul and David. There's going to be a battle. The armies are close by. The battle is probably going to be tomorrow. Now, if I were going to battle tomorrow, I would be awfully concerned. I would be so afraid. One of the things I'd be afraid of course, is my life. Wouldn't it be nice to have a little bit of comfort? So he goes to the medium. Some interpretations of the Bible call her a witch. Once again, misleading. Goes to the medium and says, hey, wait a minute. I want to find out what's going to happen tomorrow. This lady says, look, I know it's illegal, what you're asking me to do, to conjure up the dead. You'll kill me. He says, no, I'm not going to kill you. I'm the king. Okay. She says, all right. She calls up the dead prophet Samuel. Okay. And when Samuel comes up, it's like, why have you brought me up? Like he had really nothing to say about that. He's brought up from the dead. Well, he's there now, and so he answers the question. Yes, Saul, you're in big trouble. You're going to go into battle tomorrow, and you're going to be killed. Goodness. Now, Saul's not very smart. If a dead prophet, who can foresee the future, obviously, came to me and said, oh, by the way, you drive on I-15 tomorrow, you're going to get in a car accident, you're going to die. I would not be on I-15 tomorrow. No way. If there's any threat at all to my life, I might die. I'm going to be locked in the basement all day long. There's a knock on the door. I'm not going to answer it. But Saul goes to battle the next day and he's killed. Particularly when I was younger, I was something of a Bible nut. Enjoyed it a lot, read it all the time. Compared translations, read through it numerous times. It was a kick that I never really got over. I really quite enjoyed it. When I was reading this, I go, well, that's interesting. Then you kind of keep on reading. If you believe in witches, you go, there it is, right there on the page. If you do not believe in witches, you go like I did, go, turn the page. But remember, it is the beliefs that tend to have you see what you want to see. The Protestants believe. They're much more likely to believe than Catholics are. The witches, that there are witches, in reality, are taught by both Martin Luther and John Calvin. These men believe in witches. As long as Luther is alive, as long as Calvin is alive, people following their religion go directly to them to get the information from the mouth of these reformers themselves. Luther dies 1546. So he's got, close to 30 years, decades of young, aspiring ministers coming from all over Lutheran Europe to get the word directly from him. And he says there's witches and they have to be killed. So same thing is true in Calvin. I already talked about the Marian exiles who came down from England to learn their faith better directly from Calvin himself. So there are people who believe in the Reformed tradition, the Calvinist tradition. They're coming over and getting the word directly from him, and they are saying there are witches and they have to be killed. Now we can say, well, that's just what people did at that time frame. So we should excuse them because, well, everybody believed in witches. That's not true. Everybody does not believe in witches. Remember, in another context, I mentioned what we usually call the third and fourth most important people as reformers in the Protestant Reformation. These are Zwingli, remember, he's the guy who lives in Zurich. And Butzer, remember, he's the guy who lives in Strasbourg. There is no indication in any of their writings and any of their ministrations that either of them believed in witches. So you can't just say that's what everybody believes, because everybody doesn't believe it. These people chose to believe. Now, there's one thing about theory and practice. Do you really have, we have this all the time. There are statutes on books of laws that are not enforced. One thing about having a law, and another thing about enforcing it. So just saying witches exist and they ought to die is not the same thing as actually killing them, is it? No. However, in the case of Martin Luther, in the year 1540, remember he's living in Wittenberg, Germany. That's this town right here. There were 4 women accused of being witches who were executed by being burned alive in 1540, I said that wrong. And Luther is alive and functioning and living in Wittenberg at the same time. When I was in graduate school, these kind of things came up. We were discussing Michael Servetus, who happened to be killed in Geneva when Calvin was there. The issue, of course, in graduate school came up. about Luther and his ideas. And I remember, you know, I'm trying not to be obnoxious, but probably came across that way. I said, well, these people are killed in these places where the reformers live at this time, but they didn't order the deaths. It was the city council that did that. So how can we give the direct responsibility to them? The professor just looked at me and he said, he could have saved them. Yeah, he could have saved them. Ministers get the ideas, I've already mentioned this, directly from Luther and Calvin, and they spread them, pass them down generations. I happen to have a friend, Protestant, it's actually Lutheran, and I don't remember how this got brought up, but he was saying there's witches. They're out there. He says his pastor, his Lutheran pastor, the spiritual person who guides him, says that there's witches and they're out there. And I'm going, okay, so the belief is not dead. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been a persecution of witches for a very lengthy period of time. In fact, the last recorded execution of a witch in Europe is in Switzerland in 1783. So it's something that died out later on. Anyway, where does it take place? I'm not saying there is no Catholic diocese or city in Germany that persecuted it. I'm saying there's none that ever persecuted witches. But I am going to say where it is bad. It is bad in Switzerland, Protestant areas of Switzerland. It's bad in the Protestant areas of Germany. Of course, the Netherlands is almost entirely Protestant, so it's very bad there as well. This is kind of the, shall we say, the fiery furnace as far as the witch craze is concerned. There were a few Catholics in Germany that persecuted witches. However, since the church, the Catholic Church, can I say, is skeptical and actually does not believe in witches, there is really nothing in Catholic Italy. There's really nothing in Catholic Portugal. There's really nothing in Catholic Spain. Well, who actually believes in witches? Educated. Some of our studies say that the educated are actually more likely to believe. Isn't that a little contrary to what you and I usually think about? Don't we usually say that the educational process, does it not teach you to be reasonable and rational, less emotional? You can view things a little bit better from an intellectual standpoint, so you would be less likely to believe if you achieve a higher level of education. People with lower levels of education would be more likely to believe in or be superstitious, believe in these kinds of things. This, by our standards, seems therefore to be a contradiction. Well, let's go back to Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and Butzer. Luther, one of the great minds. This guy is brilliant. Calvin, one of the great minds, also very brilliant. Highly educated people, lawyer and a PhD in theology. Zwingli and Butzer are well educated, but not to that level. So Luther and Calvin believe more. Zwingli and Butzer believe not at all. Do we have an explanation for that? I don't, but bear with me. Let me speculate a little bit. In some of our areas of education, are we teaching people to rationally deal with the world? Are we teaching people to conform? I know we're an educational system. I know I'm talking to you. I hope that you don't take anything I believe or anything I'm saying as necessarily what you should believe. Yes, humor me. We have this thing called education courses. When you put down an examination, I'm trying to tell you not what's truth, but can you at least understand the kind of material I gave to you? Hopefully, if I've done a good job, hopefully if I'm good at this, hopefully if I have any insights, that you can take some of those things and you can incorporate them into your own belief system and see if they work or if they don't. If they do, it might help you a little bit. If they don't, reject them out of hand. Do not believe that anybody's educated has all the answers, because we do not. Let's go to even our education system. You go up through the levels of education. And the deeper you get into it, more money involved, sometimes there's fewer and fewer people that actually will judge your competency. And most of your professors are really nice people and they're trying to help you. We do run across a few professors that don't like you or don't like what you're doing or something. You look at them wrong, something like that. They can literally hold your life, at least your academic life, which also includes your occupational life, in their hand. And if they say conform, you will do this or you will not pass you. We will not pass you on your PhD comprehensives. We will reject your dissertation. I'll destroy you. Does that happen? I wish it never did. Swear, but it does happen. If we have an education system where you're taught to conform, if we have an education system that overemphasizes someone's ability to make you conform, is there a possibility that you will have people that will be more readily willing to buy the bottom line than to buck the system? Probably. Okay, we talked about belief. We talked about, now we're talking about torture. Remember, it's not just a belief. It's not even a legal statement. It's how it's implemented that makes the difference. Going back to the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Roman law. I mentioned this in a different context. The lower classes cannot be, a deposition from a person from lower classes is not valid unless it's taken under torture. In re-emphasizing Roman law, we find this to become more routine, in many cases completely routine, that when you bring people in, they are tortured in the court system. Now, I'm not going to say people in the Middle Ages didn't torture people. Oh, punishment, mean, and terrible things do happen. But as far as routinely in an investigation, that's a bit of a stretch in the Middle Ages. But with the emphasis on Roman law, we see this more often. We have confessions, crime eminently. We have confessions all over the place. I mean, they're keeping very good records. We have a deposition. Some guy came in. Some lady came in. They're accused of being a witch. They confess. Wow, I'm a witch. If you're being tortured, let's be hypothetical. Hope this never happens to you. If you're being tortured, what is the number one thing in your mind? Is that the tormentors stop? What will you do to keep them, to get them to stop? If you torture me, I'd confess him to shooting the Archduke Francis Ferdinand in 1914 and starting World War I. If you torture me, I'll confess shooting John Kennedy in 1963. I'll say anything you want me to say, including I'm going to sign a piece of paper that says I'm a witch. I'm also going to sign a piece of paper. Some of these are totally ludicrous, because sometimes they go so far as to say that, oh, by the way, I'm a witch, and no pressure, in other words, torture, was used in my confession, which is ludicrous because torture was routinely used. You have to be very, very careful. Why do these people, these tormentors, these civic and sometimes church officials, doing this for? Well, does that help you a little bit? I already believe, but maybe I have a little misgivings. Wouldn't it be really nice if these people confessed? I'd feel a little bit more secure about my beliefs. I was in the Navy Reserves. I was an IS, Call Intelligence. That was my rating. And among other things, I was trained as an interrogator. And we did this for several years. Very interesting experience. I was trained as an interrogator. The Marines took me back for one of my summer training for 2 weeks back in Virginia, and where I got more intensive training. And every weekend that we drilled, we would train on interrogation. When you are interrogating people, you want information. Now, according to the Geneva Convention and the Hague Conventions, which are the laws of war, you do not torture prisoners of war. That's illegal. Well, that doesn't mean it's never going to happen, even though it's illegal. But you have to be very, very careful when you're asking people questions. You have to be very, very careful to ask a question that's unambiguous. You have to be very, very careful about the nature of the information you get. Because bogus information doesn't do you much of any good at all, does it? I remember I got egg all over my face because the Marines really laid on me when I said something wrong. I was acting like I was interrogating somebody. And I said, "What's your name?" They gave me the name. And I said, "How do you spell that?" The guy said, "With letters." See, that's what you and I would say, right? And you know what we mean. He said, "No, with letters." And I said, "Well, how do you spell it?" He says, "With letters." What I should have said was this: spell it for me. Because the way I phrased it before, it could be answered in more than one way. We are so good at picking up on clues. Sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit for this. You and I, we have all kinds of social interactions with people. Our friends, our family, acquaintances. And we are awfully, awfully good in picking up on clues. Sometimes we're so good at it, we don't even realize we're doing it. You ever have a conversation with somebody and you kind of see which way it's going? They say things, they imply things, tone of voice, gestures, body posture, whatever. And on the basis of that, you can take this in certain directions. Sometimes we call this marriage. When you're having a conversation with somebody, you better have a pretty good idea of how you should proceed. We can actually feed people information into the questions. I did some interviews with World War II veterans. I believe like 20 of them. They're over in the BYU archives. They've been transcribed. If you want to read them, feel free to do so. And sometimes I kind of caught myself being misleading. And in other words, well, you're accountable. Tell me how you dealt with the fear. One guy says, I wasn't afraid. I go, okay. Well, see, didn't I feed the answer? I told him he was afraid. He came back and said, I wasn't afraid. So he didn't catch the clue. But I was asking him to answer in a certain direction, was I not? I thought it was a perfectly obvious question. I happened to mention that to another veteran. He said, he put it this way: anybody who says they weren't afraid is he didn't use this word, but anybody who said he wasn't afraid is a GD liar. He didn't spell that, he said. Well, but we do these kind of things. Now let's go back to an idiotic thing. Let's say I'm interrogating somebody who's been captured on a ship, and we have to give somebody the correct information so the F-14s can go over and bomb the right area. So I'm asking this guy, well, do you have equipment? Oh, sure, we got equipment. Well, tell me about it. I'm a little confused. I'm afraid. You people aren't treating me well. Do you have tanks? I just gave him the answer, didn't I? Do you have tanks? Oh yeah, we've got tanks. Bingo, write that down. They've got tanks. Okay. How many tanks? I'm a little confused. You know, these people. I'm afraid. Do you have many tanks? Sure. How many? I'm confused. Do you have 5? Oh yeah, we got 5 tanks. Yeah. You see what's happening? I'm just feeding him information. Sometimes you get accurate information that way. More often than not, it is questionable. Can we say, therefore, the confessions are worthless? Yes, they are. Well, can we say that part of the problem here is instability in society? That if you already have a belief and you're willing to use torture to get bogus confessions, are there instabilities in society that do have a tendency to get people more nervous? Well, sure. One thing I should have up here is wars, but let me add it in a minute. Their instability in society is including a lack of social services. I've mentioned this in another context. Let me come back to it. When the Catholic Church is thrown out, everything they did, from the priest to the nuns to all the charity, all that's gone now. Now, the Protestants aren't callous, but they don't have the resources. The priest can't help you as much. The pastor can't help you as much because he's got to have the money to support his family. The nuns, they're nice women. They want to help, but they have their families as well. Can we say loss of social services? Yeah. And even though the Protestants want to be better, they're not as good. Folkways, aren't there some old stories about things? You remember the leprechauns? Leprechauns, he's got a pot of gold. This is silly, isn't it? Where does that come from? It's certainly not Christian. Aren't there some old stories that are floating around that never really disappeared? Yeah, it's probably that. Are these technically Christian? Well, probably not. In reality, can people be afraid of that? Be afraid that there's a leprechaun that's associated with demons. Scapegoats. This is very important. We want to blame people in society. We do not want to be the weak victims of what's happening. During the coronavirus, people are saying that, well, certain people's young people are out at the beaches and they should be home. There are people that are not wearing masks, that they should be wearing masks. We can say that in these cases, you're probably increasing the likelihood, shall we say, of things being handed around. But we tend to blame people. We have economic downturns. People tend to blame, well, you don't like Catholics, you blame Catholics. We'll come to this again. I will discuss this again when we get to the Holocaust. But when people believe something and want to blame somebody, it's easy to blame the Jews. It's the Jewish bankers causing the Great Depression. Nonconformists, the guys you don't get along with. The weirdos, right? They don't comb their hair the same way I do. They don't wear the same kind of clothing. They're free spirits. They don't agree with me when I talk politics. These nonconformists, they make me nervous. It's easy to accuse them, isn't it? Foreigners, yeah, sure. Somebody from out of town, somebody from the next nation. They're not one of us. They speak with a different accent. They come from a different cultural tradition. Many years ago, reading about the California gold rush. One of the sad aspects of the American West is that we have people going west before we have law enforcement catching up to them. So the reason why we call it the wild and woolly West. We have what we call groups we call vigilantes. They're not legal, but they take matters into their own hands. Most famous in the West, there's a rustler. He stole my cattle. Well, we don't have a sheriff and we don't have a judge, so we'll just take him out and hang him ourselves. That happens in the Old West. In the California gold rush, we have issues of what we call claim jumpers. People where you can argue about, do you really have right access to the ground you're digging the gold out of? We have issues of theft. They're stealing my shovel. And we do have vigilante justice, which is inherently unjust. And you kill people. In the analysis of the people who were lynched and strung up, we find it's much more common to lynch a foreigner than it is to lynch an American. Are foreigners just more evil? No, they're just less trusted. Misfortunes. Why did the cow die? Why did the baby die? Why do bad things happen? Why is there a thunderstorm? Why do we lose our crop? Why did the locusts get blown over from Africa? Heretics, people that do not believe in what you're doing. That's a little bit like a nonconformist, maybe a little bit stronger. A heretic is simply somebody who doesn't really buy the bottom line. They're more easy to persecute. They're evil anyway. Jews. Certain aspects of the witch craze was clearly meant to persecute Jews. For example, they say the witch's Sabbath does not take place on Sunday. It takes place on Saturday, and it's sometimes on Friday, and it's sometimes called the Shabbat, the Sabbath, rather than Sunday. In other words, they're using a Hebrew term. In other words, the Jews, of course, speak Hebrew. They're using a Jewish term for some of the bad things that apparently these witches are supposed to be doing. I should have put war on there, but I'll just use this verbally. In time frames of war, we have a tendency to be more paranoid. Sure we do. In times of war, there's a tendency for us to see evil around us, and there's traitors among us. People who aren't supporting the draft laws, and we can come after them. Foreigners, once again. World War I, there's a man lynched simply because he was a German speaking German. Hadn't done anything wrong, but he's a German, living in the United States. Hey, he's probably a traitor, probably treasonous. Anytime society's put under pressure, and war puts tremendous pressure on society, you do have a tendency to have more problems. The time frame we're discussing, there's an awful lot of warfare. The Protestants are fighting the Catholics in Germany for very heavily for at least the first 2/3 of the 16th century, the 1500s. One of the worst wars in the entire history of Europe, as far as physical and human destruction, is the 30 Years' War, which takes place from 1618 to 1648. Just happens to be within that half century where we see most of the heaviest incidents of the persecution of witches. War is a factor as well. While we call that the 30 Years' War, go over to Holland where there were a lot of persecution of witches. They're actually fighting Spain. They get involved in the 30 Years' War as well. They have 80 years of war, which finally ends in 1648. Could that feed paranoia? Yes, it does. Another issue is the weak. Do you actually accuse people that are powerful? Are you going to accuse either the mayor or his wife? Are you going to accuse the chief of police or his wife? The simple answer is no. Well, why not? Couldn't they be doing evil things? The major reason is they have the means of defending themselves. Let's jump across the pond. Let's go to Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. I said that wrong. This is unusual in some respects because it's a little late. It's a little after 1650. But we do have a hysteria in New England. And some people say that paranoia was involved. Well, yeah, there was. There's been some Indian uprisings, yes. Some people have been killed, yes. There were some political instabilities, yes. All these would be factors. But what was my point? Never get old. If it comes back to me, I will come back to it. But it is an example of hysteria, and it is an example of the kinds of things that went wrong. You do have a tendency to strike out. Oh, now my point. There is a number of hysterical girls aged like 11 to 19 or something, and they're accusing people and screaming, and everybody's getting upset, and you got to grab people out, and eventually end up executing 20 people. Well, what happened? These people, these girls, shall we say, got a little bit more enthusiastic about what they were doing. And they kept on arguing up the ladder until they actually accused the wife of the governor of Massachusetts. He was Governor Phipps. When the accusation came that far, he just disbanded the court, and it was over. That was it. The court's gone. You can't have any more accusations. You can't have any more trials. You see, you accused their own people. A person that has the ability to defend him or herself are much less likely to be accused. My goodness. You accuse the chief of police, and by darn, you're going to have parking tickets and speeding tickets and reckless driving tickets from here until next week. He's going to get you. So, who's weakest in society, a man or a woman? A woman's weaker. Usually if a woman has a man to protect her, like Governor Phipps has a wife, and he will protect her, she's probably okay. What if she doesn't have a protector? Let's say she's old, either not married or a widow, doesn't have a man to protect her. She's impoverished. Why is she impoverished? Because women have a harder time making a living than men do. And she might also have little problems. She might mumble to herself or something like that. She is the most person that is most often to be accused, as pathetic as it is, because she is the weakest person in society and she cannot defend herself. The village little old hag is most likely to be accused, tortured, and killed as anybody else in society. Okay. Talked a little bit about gender earlier on. Remember witches, warlocks? And I remember I said for our discussion, we're talking about gender neutral, both men and women. Well, women do have a tendency to be accused more often than men. Can we go back to this discussion, which I was already stating? They're weak. Some of these are economic reasons. There are certain guilds in cities in Germany, for example, where you have a guild over here of men, a guild over here of women. They are rare, but they do happen. It's much more likely to find accusations, maybe from the other guild, going over against the women. There's almost no cases where it's exactly 100% women. Well, I did talk about Wittenberg losing 4 women at one time in 1540. Usually, almost always, there's a lot of women and a few men. Let's go back over to Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. 20 people are executed. What was it? 15 were women, 5 were men. Very, very typical. Well, why are we after women more often? In fact, I've read one study, for what it's worth, that in some of the more extraneous places, in Switzerland and Germany, there's supposed to be a village in Germany. They only had one woman that was still alive because the rest had been killed. It's supposed to have been a village, or 2, I believe it was, according to this study, in Switzerland, where there are no women at all. They'd all been killed. My problem with this is, the author didn't check the footnotes. I can read German. I could go back and look and see where they're at. Why on earth would they not mention those villages? They still have names. The villages still exist. I would like to see that and like to see the evidence. That might be an exaggeration. In fact, I think it is. But on the other hand, women are accused more often than men. There's another factor, not just that women are looked down upon. They're supposed to be weaker mentally. They're supposed to be weaker morally. They're certainly weaker socially and economically. But a woman can do something that a man cannot do. She can have physical relations with the devil. This doesn't have to be sex as you and I are familiar with. It can be a point of entry or exit in a person's body. It can actually be through the ear or a mole. I better not take my shirt off and show you some of my moles, but I got a few. There are birthmarks. I'm not sure we really have an explanation of birthmarks. One of my older brothers, Melvin, has a birthmark on his arm, right here. And he's got a great sense of humor. He makes jokes about it. He says, if you look at it kind of screwy, it looks something like North America. He said, you really worked well on geography tests. I could go like this, and I could copy it down. If it's on a woman, that could be evidence, according to these people, of entry or exit of an evil spirit. When that happens, the evil spirit can go inside of you. I guess you can incubate, and then you can actually give birth. It can be out in the ear, out the ear kind of thing, of demons as well. That's an accusation that they really do not use against men. I've wondered about that a little bit. I've been told that having moles is somewhat hereditary. If your father and mother have a lot of moles, chances are you will have some too. If this was enough to get you killed, having a few extra moles on your body, you would think that maybe the propensity of having moles would have declined somewhat. I guess that's possible, but it's very unlikely. What do we make of all of this? Can we say this is a warning against human progress? A lot of times, we do want to say that we are, okay, Burning Witches is a rock group, I guess, so so that's not what I'm looking for. Actually, I've never heard of them. And we have some contemporary drawings of witches being burned. Pretty awful stuff. Now, when you're under Roman law, you burn witches in Holland, you burn witches in Switzerland, you burn witches in Germany. You do not burn witches in England. You do not burn witches in New England. Going back to Salem again, 20 people are killed. One is pressed to death, the other 19 are hanged. English common law does not allow you to be burned to death. You can be hanged. Yes, you can be executed. It's under Roman law. In other words, English common law does not function on the continent where you do burn witches alive. So it does depend on where you're at. Let's go back to this. Warning against human progress? I would think so. I would think so in very real sense. We do want to believe that over time, you start early on in the forest primeval, over time things get better and better and better, that we are making continual progress. And of course, the epitome, the success of all human civilization is me. Comes up, gets better and better, and hits me, and by darn, we have arrived. This is as good as it gets. Let's be careful about that. We can say that we're going in the right direction. We can certainly say that. And I think over time, I think we're making very good progress. Human rights, liberties, access to education, the kinds of things we'll be discussing in the Enlightenment. But that does not mean you can't have a glitch. That doesn't mean that you can have times of irrationality. That doesn't mean there can be times when you think you understand and you do not. Good example of that are wars, modern wars, World War I, World War II. Another very good example of that is the Holocaust. We have irrational ideas, things that really do not make any sense. And you use them to do some of the most barbaric, to commit some of the most barbarous crimes that's ever been committed. Why am I telling you this? Let's be careful. Let's be careful in our attitudes and ideas. Let's be careful to examine what we're doing, to make sure that we don't fall into barbarism again. And this is a good example of what can happen when things go wrong. Let's cheer up a little bit. Let's go in a little bit more positive direction. And let's talk about, and let's talk about the development of human rights. Same time frame, we're talking about competing areas, and we have, of course, the Lutherans and the Catholics, Protestants, and the other peoples. At the same time, we're seeing something more positive coming out of this. And that, by that I mean from human relationships. And that is the development of human rights. The ability for people to have their will expressed in government and have that meaningful. Well, early on, the Lutherans legitimate absolutism. Absolutism meaning the power, shall we say, of a monarch to control society. I've already mentioned this, that Martin Luther essentially, and he probably had to do this at some level, to give authority over to the state. And of course, in doing so, the state wants to have the Lutherans to support their ideas. According to Lutheranism, people have no inherent justice. By inherent justice, it means they cannot choose to do right and wrong. The Lord can choose to work through them, but they cannot choose in and of themselves. So people cannot decide for themselves. That goes back to legitimating absolutism. You have to have somebody else, hopefully that has the Spirit of the Lord, but somebody else to decide for them. Now, it's going to be the Protestants later on that's going to make really strong advances in this area. So I'm not trying to say that the Protestants are really lost in this repressive ideology. That's not true, but I will come back to that. Something's happening in Spain. I already mentioned the age of exploration. You got Spain and other countries going around the world, setting up colonies and conquering Indians. A question we have to ask ourselves in Spain, these are intellectual discussions, and that happens to be, are Indians human? Well, look, we're enslaving them, we're working them to death, we're sometimes cutting off their limbs, we're forcing conversions on them. Is this justified? Well, from our standpoint, this is awful. You're treating human beings very badly. Which brings me to the question. The Spanish intellectuals are arguing, are Indians in fact human? And if they are human, what difference does this make? Now, I think this is kind of a silly argument because it's very, very easy. We find people from numerous nationalities, including Africans brought over slaves, Europeans, that are coming to the Americas, and they don't have any problem at all in marrying local people and having kids. That's not a problem at all. And the kids have kids as well. So obviously we're very closely related, but does that really make them human? See, a question we have to ask, if you marry an Indian woman, you have a child, is that child human? If she's not human, then you might have to ask a different question. There's a council. It's intellectuals. The government's not really directly involved. It's a council of Valladolid. Valladolid is a city in Spain where these are educated, university people that are coming to debate human nature and to see what the implications that has on how we should treat Indians. One of the men that comes is, and my Spanish is awful, Juan Gines de Sepulveda. We just usually remember him as Sepulveda. Sepulveda is often called the father of modern racism. I would certainly say that, at least as far as an intellectual argument is concerned. And he says this, that Indians are inferior. They are natural slaves. Somehow deity, the Lord, in his infinite wisdom, made them as a subspecies. They are natural slaves. Therefore, the bad treatment of them is by that which is natural and normal. And you can take these people, do not give them the ability to choose for religion, and you can force them to convert. One of the more important persons in the entire debate and shall we say, the entire question over how to treat Indians is Bartolomé de las Casas. I have been told in certain areas of Latin America, he is still esteemed very highly. His argument at Valladolid is this, that the Indians can perceive right and wrong. Therefore, they are essentially human. And you cannot use force, probably to control them, also to convert them. Now, from our standpoint, de las Casas is completely correct. Can we say at this debate, this council, that he actually got the stronger case? As I recall, the council actually decided for him. Unfortunately, as far as we can tell, this doesn't really change how Indians were treated in the Americas. But what we're talking about here is an idea. And let's see how this idea plays out. And let's see how this idea eventually gives us more freedom in government. A little after this time, we have one of the more important Spanish intellectuals this time frame. This is Francisco Suarez. There's another intellectual called De Soto who's involved in similar things at about the same time. Sometimes we say it's De Soto and Suarez's ideas. For the purpose of our discussion, I'm going to concentrate on Suarez because he is a little bit more important. But he's not the only person thinking these directions. According to Suarez, the doctrine of no inherent justice, remember you cannot choose to be good or bad, is the key to the Protestant heresies. That is the most important of them all. He talks about the law of nature. Term we're going to see used in legal system. In fact, I've heard this used in legal systems even today. The law of nature, which he is really saying, the law of nature, the natural law, is the law of God. And he says that the nature of the human being is much more elevated than anything Sepulveda had ever imagined. There is a gift in all human beings, which is a direct gift from God. That is your innate ability to understand right and wrong and to make proper decisions, to do good. You can decide. We call this your conscience. Sometimes people say it's in your brain, it's in the back of your head someplace. Wherever you want to say, it is a direct spiritual gift from the Lord. You can choose to be good if you want to. So all human beings are equal in that sense. According to him, human beings are equal yet in another sense. We are technically equal in our ability to perceive the will of God. We are equal in our ability to do that which is right. Therefore, we should be equal in society. A man who might be a absolutist ruler, he has no more access to the will of God than anybody else. We're free in that sense. So should we be free in society? We all are children of God in that sense. Should we not have the ability to be free? Well, what does this do to slavery? Still enslaving people in Latin America. Spanish are still doing this. See, he's arguing very strongly against that kind of thing, is he not? One of the ways you talk about or you express your freedom is in your ability to have property. Property can be a very big topic. You and I think of property. I own a car, my clothing, my house, if I happen to be that fortunate. This is property. They believe that. Suarez does believe this. But he also believes that any time you can have the fruits of your own labor, doesn't have to necessarily be a car and a house. It can be grain. It can be, if you're a craftsman, you're a blacksmith, it's the horseshoe you make. And you get income from your grain, you get income from your bricks. You have the right as a free person to have the fruits of your own labor. This goes back and attacks slavery, does it not? Slavery says, in slavery, you don't, in extreme forms of slavery, chattel forms of slavery, you don't even own your own body. You certainly don't own the fruits of your own labor because you work and somebody else does it. You bake the bread, but somebody else eats it. Can you see how modern this is in their outlook of a free society? And according to Suarez, this is of the highest of all possible authorities because the law of nature comes directly from God. One thing I do want to mention, which he did as well, he said, well, what would society look like if God had created societies? That's an interesting question, is it not? One of which is that, well, did God ever create a society? Yes. Adam and Eve. Got Adam and Eve, and you know the story. They get thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They have children. There's Cain, there's Abel, and there's others. Who was the Lord? Who was the noble? Who was the slave? You see, that's not represented. Suarez believes in his law of nature, the law of God, that he gave an example of creating the ideal society where everybody has a conscience, where everybody's equal, free, and you have the fruits of your own labors. Once again, this is the highest of all possible authority. I am running out of time. Unfortunately, I can't get the English Civil War. We'll have to do it next time. I appreciate you staying with this. Hopefully, if I've said anything that you have misunderstood, you can come back and review it. In the meantime, enjoy your day, whatever you're doing, and I'll speak to you again next time.